Episode, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about encryption today. And I'm not going to go too much into the details of encryption, but just a basic understanding, something that any IS auditor or IT auditor needs to understand as part of encryption, because you need to understand how things work in order to be able to perform a really good audit. And definitely encryption nowadays is huge because everything is online, everything is on the internet. We have a lot of private information, and we want to make sure that it's transferring from one server to another, one computer to another on the internet, but on a secure manner. So with that, we are going to take a look at a few additional things over here. I'm gonna be drawing some things because I feel that encryption, if I talk through, it's going to be really hard to explain all the concepts and everything. So I'm gonna be drawing a few things, and definitely now with all the pandemic, the COVID-19, a lot of people working from home, a lot of companies, especially corporations, mid-sized companies, want to make sure that their employees that are working from home have a secure connection. So let's take a look a little bit more how encryption works and how that can be applied to multiple levels, multiple areas. With that said, let's get started over here. So let me just pull out over here my screen. Okay, so let's go with the basic level of encryption. The basic level of encryption is using what is called a symmetric key. Symmetric key. And basically a symmetric key means that we're gonna use a key between the person who is sending the message and the person who's receiving. So let's say the person who's sending the message is Bob. Sorry. Is Alice. And the person receiving here is Bob. So we have two people. Alice wants to send a message to Bob, but wants to make sure that it's encrypted. So if someone were to eavesdrop over here and look for that message, they may not know what exactly it is. So Alice comes with a key over here. And Alice says, hey, multiply everything by 5. And this is what we are going to be calling the key, in this case the symmetric key. Well, Alice have to communicate that key to Bob. So one of the biggest challenges for encryption is key management. Because how Alice will communicate that key with Bob? Well, if they both sit in the same location together, right, then they can just talk to each other and it's pretty much safe unless someone else hear it, right? Now, what happens if Alice is in the other side of the world? Well, Alice could pick up the phone and tell that Bob, but now what happens if someone is listening to the phone, right? So that's why it's the key, like how we maintain our keys is going to be essential. And we're gonna be talking a little bit further how to solve those issues, but let's go back over here with the fundamentals. So I'm just gonna work with numbers because I think that's the easiest way to explain over here how the key works. So Alice, we're gonna call it a plain text. So plain text is basically what it is. It's the plain text what Alice wants to send. And Alice wants to send to Bob the number 10. So Alice takes the plain text, puts the key, so multiplies by 5, and then gets the result, which is the encrypted file, which will be 50. So Alice sent number 50 to Bob. So Bob comes over here and Bob applies basically the opposite. The Bob divided by 5. So this is the key because Bob knows what the key is. And the result is 10, which is the plain text. And that's how, in a very easy way to explain, encryption works. Now, if you remember, like if we have, for example, A or B or C, all of those ones, at the end of the day, these are numbers using the ASCII or ASCII numbering. So at the end, all of these encryptions is going to be a lot of mathematical calculations. And even though if we think about later on, all of these things always translate in ones and zeros. So there's also a lot of math in the binary perspective. So that's where the key is always going to be some sort of mathematical issue, something that is actually more complicated than a multiplication. Usually it's going to be some elliptical formula or something similar. I'm not gonna go too much in detail with that because you don't need to know like what formulas they're using, what math or anything. We just need to know how this works from an overall perspective, like I won't say necessarily a 10,000 feet perspective or view, but definitely a high level view on how all of these things work. Now, let's talk about another thing over here. So let's delete this one. Let me see. How can I delete this? Okay. This worked perfectly. So let's talk now about the asymmetric key. Asymmetric key. I think I missed an S over here. So an asymmetric key is basically a key that is not the same in both sides. So remember we have here Alice and we have over here Bob. And the previous key was multiplied by 5. So that was the symmetric key because Alice multiplied by 5, Bob knows that it has to basically do the opposite, which is divided by 5. Now, in an asymmetric key, Alice will have what is called a private key, and it will have what is called a public key. And basically that's what it means. Public key means that it's out there on the internet. Call this one the internet. So anyone knows what this public key is. Now this private key is only available to Alice. Alice is the only one who have that key. She's never gonna release that key. She's never gonna tell anyone what that key is. It's totally private, and that's the key management that we were talking before. We want to make sure that Alice will never disclose this private key. So how this works, whenever someone wants to communicate to Alice, or let's take a look at over here. So we have the private key, and then we have here the public key, same thing. So I don't want to confuse you guys. So the public key comes over here to the internet, right? So Alice wants to send a message to Bob. She wants to send, "Hi, Bob." That's the message that Alice wants to send. So she takes this message. Behind the scenes, you know, is the ones and zeros and everything else. And what she does, she basically takes the public key from Bob. So she takes the public key from Bob. So that's Bob, public key. There we go. And basically what the public key does, it only encrypts. It's not like this asymmetric key that the same key do both encryption and decryption. Over here, the public key, like how the math works, I'm not gonna go in deep again on that. You can search it on Google or anything. It's a complicated math. But basically it's almost similar to the multiplication and division. There's a math behind over there where you could have different values and you can arise to the same place. Anyways, so the public key, the only way that a public key works is to encrypt something. So if you have this text, this plain text, right? So let's put over here, this is the plain text. Plain text. So if you have here the plain text and you put the public key, it's going to encrypt. And the only way to decrypt is with the private key. These two are always paired. Like in order to create a public key, you need a private key. So you actually create first the private key, and using math, it will create the public key. So these two are related mathematically. So what happens if I take an encrypted text that I use here with the public key and I put another public key on top of that? Well, it's just gonna say another layer of encryption. It's not gonna work, it's gonna mess up things, but think about like on a very simple perspective, that's what it's going to do. It's not gonna unencrypt the message. So when Alice wants to send this "Hi Bob" message to Bob, she takes the Bob private key, public key. Put it over here so we don't confuse public key. So she's gonna take Bob's public key because Bob's public key is only used to encrypt messages. So she's gonna take that and she's gonna apply it to the message, and she's going to send the encrypted message to Bob. And Bob basically is going to use his private key. Let's use another color. Doing a lot of arrows over there. Bob is going to use his private key, apply it to the encryption, and basically unencrypt that to say, "Hi, Bob." The plain text. And that's how basically asymmetric key works. That's how basically private and public key works. Now, what happens if Bob wants to transmit something to Alice? Well, Bob is going to do the same thing, saying, "Hey, Alice." That's the message. He's gonna take Alice public key, put it over there, send encryption, and Alice is going to take her private key and unencrypt it over here. And that's basically the theory behind. That's the entire theory on how encryption, public keys, and private keys work. Now, there is a downturn over here, we can call it that way, of using asymmetric versus symmetric keys. Symmetric keys are shorter in length because you don't have to be over complex on the mathematical problem because you only have one key. So that key needs to be very well protected. You shouldn't be giving to anyone. But because it's a shorter type of math, when you have messages that are long, let's say for example a picture can be a big message, right? Like 2, 3, or 4 megabyte. And nowadays, of course, you have like pictures that are like 20 megabytes, right? But let's say something like that is a huge message. And if you want to encrypt a picture using asymmetric key, it's going to do it really fast because the mathematical problem is not that complex. And with the power of our computers nowadays and everything, it can just do it in a few seconds. Now, the problem with asymmetric keys is that asymmetric keys is way longer. Like, if you think about like symmetric keys this size, like asymmetric key, like it goes outside of my camera over here. It goes all the way. Because it's that complex of a math problem, if you send a huge message, the computer is gonna take a few minutes potentially, depending on how big that message is, to both encrypt and unencrypt. So let's say, for example, you're doing your regular conversation, chats, and everything, or for example, a website. A website can have like multiple images and everything. It's going to load really, really slow. And what happens when a website loads slow? Well, you just exit and go to the next one, right? So that's the biggest issue of using a symmetric key versus symmetric key. Symmetric key, you have to share your key. And as we mentioned before, if that key goes in the wrong hands, or how you are gonna even share that key at the beginning, right? With asymmetric key, you don't have to share anything. The public key is already public. Anyone can use it to encrypt things, and you use your private key to unencrypt any messages that someone is sending to you. So they basically look at it from this perspective of the benefits and the cons and pros, and they try to figure out, okay, how can we make this even better? And I don't know who came up with, probably we can research that, some scientist or someone who knows math, I guess, comes with this concept of, well, actually it's not someone with math, actually it's someone who understands all these concepts. Someone with math is the person who basically did the mathematical issue or problem to basically do the keys. But anyone who understood the problem tried to think about, okay, the main issue is to share the key. How can I share the key that is a symmetric key? So whenever we send big messages, it's easy to encrypt and unencrypt. So with that, they came with this, I think it's a program, PGP. Because at the end of the day, it's not that the person you receive the message that is encrypted, you're not doing the math. Like the computer is doing the math. So there's a program called PGP that's pretty good privacy. Pretty good privacy. which basically leverages, my goodness, my lines are everywhere. Basically leverages the concept of both asymmetric and symmetric key. Basically takes the best of both worlds. So how that works, let's say we have here Alice, same as we had it before, and we have Bob. So Alice wants to send her symmetric key. Symmetric key. And this symmetric key is something that it was just randomly generated right now. So it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So randomly was generated somehow, let's say. But she needs a secure way to transfer this key to Bob. Now we want to use symmetric key because she wants to send later on pictures, images, videos, whatever thing, right? So she knows that we cannot send with an asymmetric key because it's gonna take way too much time. But at the same time, it's like, okay, how can we share this with Bob? Now, she knows that Bob have a public key on the internet. So what she's gonna do, she's gonna use the symmetric key as the message. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it's going to encrypt that symmetric key using Bob public key. So you probably know where I'm going with this. Now Bob uses his private key to unencrypt it, and he can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now Bob knows that this is going to be the symmetric key that is going to be used for later messages. Then after that, Alice will now send her message saying, hey, this is the picture of the mountains that she just took last week, and there's the sun over there, or whatever thing. And then she will use the symmetric key, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it will send the encrypted file, and Bob will receive the picture of the mountains with the sun and all the other things. So now let's go back, because I know that I went a little bit too fast over there. With that, we solved 2 problems. The first problem is how can we share the symmetric key? First of all, we created a random symmetric key for this purpose of communications, because what happens if Alice later on wants to communicate with John over here, right? She's not gonna use the same symmetric key because it defeats the entire purpose, right? So that's why it's a random created symmetric key that it sends only to Bob, but because you cannot send that in plain text, she uses Bob's public key to encrypt that symmetric key. With that, it sends over there to Bob, and now Bob have this key, and now she can send any type of big files, videos, or anything. And that's what basically is the PGP. That's a pretty good privacy. That's the basics of any encryption methodology using nowadays. Now, the only thing that it changes is how this public key and private key is calculated, the math behind it. If you have here, for example, encryptions of 128 bits, 256 bits, it's basically how long those encryption keys are. Of course, the longer the encryption key is, the harder it is to try to figure it out, or to, trying to kind of exploit the key, if we can call it that way. But at the same time, the longer the key is, it's gonna take more resources from the computer, especially if you have a bigger file. So with that, I hope this about like almost 20 minutes on just encryption, how it works, and definitely hope it gives you more ideas on how encryption works, and now thinking a little bit further on how you will apply this when you're auditing. Now, depending on the type of audit that you're performing, one of the areas that I've seen it a lot of auditors doing is looking at how PGP is being implemented, making sure that whenever they have files to be transmitted from one place to another using encryption, that they're using PGP and how that's encrypted, how it's managing the keys to make sure that no one else have access to this symmetric key. And there's a few other things over there that we can explain later on. But definitely, if you have a good understanding on how encryption works, it will help you to better understand how a company is implementing those keys, how they're implementing this encryption method. And you can also ask better questions because you understand the process. With that, let me know if you have any questions at all. Leave any comments. If you really like the content that I'm putting over here, definitely subscribe to my channel. That's the way that you can support a lot of people. I've using already on YouTube. So definitely click the button, I think it's below or somewhere over here, to subscribe to my channel. Definitely I would like to hear more about you. What's your journey? Are you a current IT auditor? Why you're looking this video? Do you have any questions? Is there anything else that I missed and you would like to hear more? Probably I can do another video on that. So definitely leave me comments below. Don't forget to subscribe on my channel and we'll see you on the next video.